Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Communications here at SBAM. Thanks for joining us today. I want to start off the show by acknowledging that today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And so just wanted to mention that and recognize and honor his contributions to our country.
You know, a really cool fact, Sarah, is that the what is undoubtedly Martin Luther King Jr.'s most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech, was actually given in Detroit before it was given on the mall in Washington, D.C. It was a speech that he made in several locations, but the very first time that those words were uttered or at least in public, were uttered, were in Detroit. So really important part of the heritage of our country. And so happy Martin Luther King Day to everybody today.
Well, I did not know that, so I love that I learned something new today. Thanks, Brian. All right, we have some things we need to update our viewers on today. The first of which is the Earned Sick Time Act. And since we met last Monday, the bills were in committee. And Brian, you actually testified in support of those bills. Why don't you walk us through what happened there?
Yeah, we have a strategic partnership with the Michigan Black Business Alliance, and it's another association made up of mostly small businesses. And the executive director of the alliance joined me in testifying in front of a special select committee. Charity Dean is her name, and we laid out the case from a small business perspective on why there it is necessary, essential that the legislature pass the Earned Sick Time Act reform bills that have been introduced in the House of Representatives and were the first up. So we talked last time about these bills being introduced, bills number 4001 and 4002. They would slow down the minimum wage increase, so it's set to ramp up very quickly and preserve the tipped wage credit for the restaurant and bar hospitality industry that makes heavy use of those tools. But the Earned Sick Time Act testimony was really quite insightful. You saw people from across the spectrum of business and organizations, including, by the way, 911 central dispatchers that came in and talked about the importance of these changes being made. Our employers are well aware of the risks that come along with this, and a lot of it has to do with the loss of control of scheduling. And so the dispatchers made a really strong argument for why having reliable and predictable scheduling, in some cases, literally is a matter of life and death. Very, very powerful testimony. Went on for hours, and then they came back because there were so many people waiting to testify, and did even more testimony on Thursday. So on Tuesday and Thursday, there was lots of testimony before this House committee, and the bills would be a great help if they were to pass. They do change. It gives employers more control over how they schedule and requiring notice. It allows for combined leave banks in a more straightforward and explicitly authorized way. Anybody who's watched our seminars know that it is technically possible to offer a combined leave bank, but it's complicated and clunky. Um, there's other important changes that are made as well, including a small business exemption. Now, this is just in the House of Representatives. It is a long way from making it to the governor's desk by way of signature, but it did come out of the House committee on on Thursday. So it was voted out, and it had broad bipartisan support again on the committee. So there are 15 members of the House of Representatives that serve on that special select committee considering those two bills. And the minimum wage slowdown and the preservation of the tipped wage credit passed 14 to 0 to 1, meaning that one representative abstained from the vote. But otherwise 14, nobody voted no. And the ESTA fixes were literally 15 to 0. So we're really happy to see this come out of the committee with unanimous, especially the ESTA fixes with unanimous support, including from all Republicans and all Democrats on that committee.
All right, and so Brian, would you give us a little primer about what it means to come out of committee and kind of talk about what the next steps are as it relates to these bills?
Yeah, I think it does. While we're really, really happy about those bills coming out of committee, I think it does make sense to temper expectations because what that means is that there's a subset of representatives that considered, took testimony, and voted a bill out. And when we look at the people that served on that committee, the vast majority we knew at SBAM, we knew because we just went through an election cycle and we supported candidates that support small businesses. We knew that the Republicans and the Democrats who happen to be uh, assigned to that committee were generally supportive of our position, the small business position on these bills. But that just means those bills are advanced to the full House of Representatives, where instead of 15 representatives, there's 110. Now, we are expecting that the House of Representatives will vote on those two bills yet this week, probably Wednesday or maybe Thursday. And I do expect that the bills will pass the House of Representatives. I think that they will get at least 70 out of 110 votes, but I'm not going to be surprised if it gets up around 85 votes. So somewhere between that 70 to 85 votes, depending on how much pressure the unions put on the system as they start working their way through the process. There's vehement and adamant opposition still from the unions on making any changes at all on the bills, and so they'll definitely flex as it goes through the process. So we'll see how many votes, but I'm supremely confident that the bills will make it through the House of Representatives. Then they go to the Senate, and the Senate they will face significant opposition. Okay, the Senate is a whole different ball game. The results that you get out of the House do not reflect what the bills face in the Senate. The Senate is significantly less friendly to small businesses and policies that favor small businesses, and so there'll be a bigger uphill battle there. We've seen some signals that they're looking to extract essentially a pound of flesh out of the business community in exchange for these bills. In other words, saying if we give you some of what's in those bills, then we're going to hurt you in other ways. And so, in other words, other employer mandates, and they're not necessarily going to be better than um, than the status quo. So it's going to be a complicated situation to navigate. That's why I say we're really pleased that the House has made it a priority. We're really pleased to see bipartisan support, and we are going to be very pleased this week to see those bills move out of the House of Representatives, which I think they probably will. But it does make sense to temper expectations because the scenario in the Senate is very, very different. Now, let's look even further beyond that. Let's say that somehow a deal is struck and the bills do move out of the Senate, and that big obstacle is somehow overcome, and they make it to the governor's desk for a signature. Frankly, I think the governor would sign them. She has not made any direct statements indicating any particular demands or things that are off the table. And usually, my experience is that usually if the governor is not explicit about opposition, it means that she's probably willing to support or would support something if it was able to make it through the legislative process. And frankly, I think the Senate is a bigger obstacle than the governor would be on an issue like this. So if it can get through the Senate, it probably means that it's the sort of thing that the governor could sign. So that's just conjecture. I don't have any kind of statement or inside knowledge or information other than experience to go on. So we're going to work this. February 21st is the date when the law, the Supreme Court decision goes into effect. And so we're going to do our darndest to have something happen before February 21st.
All right, so we do have a couple of opportunities for our members, Brian, to educate themselves further in these areas. One is we are still trying to help people comply with what we know will be, as of today anyway, in effect on February 21st. And so we have a compliance webinar. This is the third one that we've done tomorrow at 11 a.m. I'm going to share the link to that here in the chat. But then you've also invited Representative Schuette to join you next Monday for another webinar that kind of talks about the legislation. You want to just give a little bit of an overview on that?
Yeah, and these are two different issues. So we've talked about, going back months, we've been doing webinars on the Earned Sick Time Act and the changes that will come from it, especially after the department put out frequently asked questions. And then after the legislature closed down last year without passing any fixes, we went into compliance mode. So the last few webinars, including the one that's going to be tomorrow, it's all about compliance with the law. And so we're laying out tools and strategies to comply with the Earned Sick Time Act. But we also want to continue the political discussion about how the policy changes go through the political system, through the legislature. Remember when I talked about that committee, the select committee on considering the earned sick time and minimum wage changes. The chair of that committee is Bill G. Schuette. So if the name Bill Schuette sounds familiar to you and you're thinking like Attorney General, former Attorney General, not that Bill Schuette, it actually happens to be his son, Bill G. Schuette, and he was the chair of that committee and did a great job in shepherding those bills through, had a voluminous amount of testimony and did not shut down opposition, let opposition come and speak. And and also, of course, there was a lot of supportive testimony in the committee as well. So we've asked Representative Schuette to come and spend some time in talking with us about the policies, his insights from the committee process and as they made their way through the House, and also hopefully some insights on the prospects of something happening before February 21st. So the calendar is very short and it's kind of out of his hands now, but he's right there in the middle of the arena. So we're going to try to get as much insight as we can from him as we hope that these bills can make it through the process.
All right, thanks. And again, I shared those links here on Zoom and on Facebook. All right, so let's go to one of our new segments. We're going to call it Election Watch 2026. And last week, you hinted that you thought maybe Senator Nesbitt would be throwing his hat into the ring for the race for governor, and your prediction came true.
Yeah, it happened actually a little bit faster than I was expecting it. I knew that he was considering it, and I didn't think it would be very long before Senator Nesbitt, the Senate Minority Leader in the Michigan State Senate, would announce. And that happened last week after the small business briefing, a day or two after the small business briefing, I think. So the that that announcement it marks the first official announcement of somebody who's absolutely in. The former Attorney General Mike Cox has also all but announced, has like an exploratory committee. You don't form an exploratory committee unless you're running, but is not announced yet. Eric Nesbitt is the first one to announce, and within 3 days, reported raising $1 million, which is it's a pretty good haul, especially for a state senator from Southwest Michigan. It's just an area of the state that is very isolated from a lot of the rest of the state, and so it's harder to run for office from there. It's why he had to start so early, and it's why $1 million raised in the first 3 days is so impressive. The other thing I wanted to mention too about think about the resumes of people that become governor, and you might think, well, state legislator, how likely is that? But Senate caucus leaders, as of late, have actually had some pretty good luck in getting elected. If you think of the last four governors, two of them were former Senate caucus leaders. Governor Whitmer, of course, was a Senate minority leader, just like Eric Nesbitt is a Senate minority leader, opposite parties, but both had the same position in the Senate. And then going back, if you count Governor Whitmer, 4 governors ago, Governor Engler was the Senate majority leader when he ran for and became governor as well. So it is the sort of thing on a resume that has, as of late, proven to be somebody that's a real contender in the process. So best wishes to Eric Nesbitt. There will be probably many more, I think, in this election, since it's a totally wide open field, and Michigan being such a purple state, and there being an independent candidate in there lowers the win threshold. I think that it's going to be a pretty crowded field.
All right, another segment that we have on the show of late is kind of a Corporate Transparency Act update, kind of a watch. So any news from since we met last week?
Don't want anybody to lose sight of this or forget that the Corporate Transparency Act is still on the books. There happens to be a nationwide injunction against the law, so the law has been paused from enforcement. That came out of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The government on December 31st um, challenged or appealed that stay in the law to the U.S. Supreme Court on January 12th. Justice Alito, who is considering that stay, he handles all of the kind of appeal requests out of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Um, the deadline for filing briefs was on January 12th. So obviously January 12th was a little over a week ago. And so there is it's just the waiting game. And really there could be a decision any day, and that decision will come in a couple different forms. The stay will either be upheld, and so it'll be status quo until the case is litigated. The stay could be lifted entirely. So, in other words, the Corporate Transparency Act would be back on while the appeal happens, or um, the stay could be limited to just the plaintiffs in the case. In other words, it wouldn't have nationwide effect, but only the plaintiffs in that specific case. So that's what's happening on the case that resulted in the stay. Nothing has changed with the stay yet, but the other track that we have going is SBAM's own challenge to this law, which is in the Western District Court of Michigan, and we are expecting a decision from that case. It could literally be any day now. All the arguments are made way past arguing stays and injunctions and things, and it's just literally a final decision at the district court level on the merits of the law. So it's a waiting game, but I don't think we'll be waiting much longer.
All right, so today marks the beginning of a new presidential term, and with this new term, we'll likely see several executive actions issued. What are your predictions as to what will be top of the list?
The new president's advisors and team did do some briefings in the media about what some of the early executive actions could be. So what I've there's likely to be about 100 of them in the next couple days. So what I've tried to on public accounts and the reporting on it to sort out the business ones or ones that have at least some general impact on business, the way that our economy works here in in Michigan and across the U.S. So this is not a complete list, but I just tried to keep track of and piece together things as they came in. First, I think there will be some several actions around the border, so immigration and the border. That's likely to include some sort of a declaration of emergency so that there can be deployment of additional resources without Congress, maybe like literal building of a wall that had started before in his first term and is likely to continue in some way, shape, or form. So likely to be pretty big immigration changes that happen through executive actions. And these more and more is happening these days by executive action, which makes the swings between administrations bigger. Takes longer and it's harder to change things in the law. But when one administration does something by executive action, the next one can just change direction by the same tool of executive action. I will say that there's the threat of tariffs, and I'm going to get to tariffs in a minute, with Mexico has already resulted in some action on the Mexican side of the border in terms of uh, diverting and confiscating fentanyl in particular, and border crossing activity has gone quite a ways down since these actions had started about a year ago when there was an action that failed in Congress, and so you're just likely to see all those tools probably probably increase. But the designation of drug cartels as global terrorists is a tool in the toolbox that hasn't been um, used in a big way. It gives law enforcement more tools as well. The the on the federal workforce, so the bureaucracy within the federal government, the you're likely to see remote policies come to an end. So right now, the vast majority of federal workers who aren't in security or maintenance are remote workers, and so you'll see very likely some big sweeping actions that require the federal workers within the bureaucracy to return back to the office. Um, I think tariffs and trade are the areas where you're probably likely to see the biggest changes. And there's been some mixed signals sent out, so we'll have to wait and see how broad these are. But tariffs upwards of probably more in the 20% range, although some have said in certain select areas up to 100%. The there's so you'll see implementation of tariffs, but maybe the start of a new department that is associated with tariffs. So we're all familiar with the Internal Revenue Service. You might see something new formed called the External Revenue Service, which is to manage trade and tariffs associated with it. You're also probably going to see some investigations launched to determine adherence to previous trade agreements. So trade agreements that are already in place, how are they working, and then decisions that will come from that. So I think probably trade is going to be the biggest one where you see a difference, and then on energy policies, you should expect to see very aggressive moves toward domestic production of energy. And there are certain things like tariffs, for example, that depending on a lot of factors could actually result in higher prices of certain goods. Now, in terms of real increases, if you have more income at home and higher prices, the real difference can be mitigated somewhat, but the math just has to work out after implementation to find out how that turns out. I think the tool in the toolbox that the administration is counting on is that an offset will be their ability to lower the cost of energy, and so I think you should see probably very aggressive action on domestic production of energy. And apparently, in the social media game, TikTok was apparently briefly offline and then back online on the promise that somehow that law that required the Chinese owned company to divest a controlling interest in TikTok or have it banned in the US. Whatever signals needed to be sent to have that go back online, apparently they were sent, because my understanding it was offline for 14 hours and back. And then but the law still stands, and the law is pretty explicit. I was kind of interested in it. I pulled it up over the weekend just to see what it says. It's pretty explicit. So I think that some sort of either they're going to have to change the law. I mean, delaying is one thing, but they're either going to have to change the law or work out some sort of a deal for the divestiture of a controlling interest in it. It's still, I view it very much still a live issue, but but apparently whatever signals needed to be sent to make them comfortable putting it back online were sent, and we'll have to stay tuned for that.
All right, it is time for today's Data Monday.
All right, so we do have some inflation numbers that are probably the most important thing that we have been watching for the last couple of years. So on this, uh, looking at the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and then that's in blue, and then in orange is the core inflation, taking out food and energy. As you can see, little higher on the overall headline CPI, and just pretty consistent, tick down just a little bit on the core. So still at a level where it's just kind of stubbornly been hanging around that 3% mark for a while. It's the reason why interest rates, there's not much expectation that interest rates will go down. Um, if you were to look at commodities versus services, you'll see that commodities are actually deflationary. So think of tangible goods and deflationary uh, territory, but cost of services still, while it's lower, it's still at 4.4%. So it's very much a different picture between services and goods. The producer price index, so this is the cost of making things. You see here that that the normal over the last 30 years of finished consumers goods, you would see it more like 3 or 4%, and it's up, it's still running pretty high, and it's still increasing. But that's different than the overall cost of finished goods. So consumer goods versus overall goods. You see overall goods is looks more historically normal. And then the materials components for manufacturing, you'll see actually is in deflationary territory, which is why you might see the difference between that consumer finished goods and which would include sales from all different sources from business to business. All right. NFIB, their national surveys out, and there are a couple of things I thought were interesting enough to include in here. So this is just a chart that superimposes the Fed funds rate over the expected credit conditions. So you see that expected credit conditions increasing or improving as the Fed funds rate comes down, although it is, I think it's going to, that Fed funds rate, think of that as what your line of credit, if you have one, is tied to, likely to be stuck there for another 6 months, wherever it's at right now. The hiring plans, you see a couple of signs of optimism. Hiring plans are improving, and also good time to expand. Both kind of sharp increases. This one especially a kind of an unusually sharp increase. And by the way, our surveys in Michigan do not show that much of an increase. But this national survey certainly does. Those that are expecting higher prices and those who expect to increase their prices over the next 3 months, both showing kind of modest upward increases and are hovering at levels that are a little high. I like this chart. It's the average, the real average weekly earnings. So this is the earnings that people have minus inflation. And you'll see now we've got here a track record of this green. Everywhere you see green, that means that income growth is higher than inflation. So slowly but surely, it's kind of catching back up from this red. Everywhere you see red, that's where purchasing power was lost. So income minus inflation was a negative number. So when will people make up all this? Is when the space under the green line over here to the right exceeds the space under the colored in red here. So you can see, just you don't have to be a mathematician to see that there's still a ways to go before people catch up where they were. And then the final thing I wanted to show you is that while both still negative, the Atlas van lines and the and also United van lines, they both put out their annual in versus out movements. And while they're both negative, they both actually show some improvement. That is to say, less negative in terms of outbound migration. And actually, Sarah, that matched up pretty well with what that census report that we talked about last week as well, which showed that there was still outbound migration, but less than we had seen in recent years. So that is today's Data Monday. No big surprises in there other than nationwide small business optimism was took such a big sharp increase, and I'll look forward to seeing whether or not maybe that's happened here in Michigan, although I think some of these laws that are about to go into effect, like the Earned Sick Time Act, might dampen that enthusiasm here in Michigan.
All right, well, thanks for that report, Brian, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. We will see you back here next Monday at 3 p.m. Have a great week.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.